Welcome to RPG Heroes, a podcast where every other week I speak to a true hero in the realm of role-playing games about their journey, their craft, and their views. As your host, I will focus on one particular aspect of this wonderful hobby for the interview, regale you with stories from my own 25 years of experience with role-playing games, and reflect on the major takeaways from the interview. Join me now on this epic journey and awaken the hero in you. Welcome to episode 13 already. This one is about adventure design and minimalism in RPGs. And the person to help us figure all that out today is Kelsey Dionne, the creative genius behind the Arcane Library. We will talk about how to design good, usable adventures for your home games and possibly for publishing, how to use minimalism in gaming, and of course, who Kelsey's RPG heroes are. Now, you might notice a significant dip in the quality of my voice, and that is related to seasonal allergies. Apparently, the pollen count is higher than it's ever been, at least here in my vicinity, and it's kind of killing me. So please bear with me as I snivel my way through this episode. Now, before we dive into all that RPG goodness, a little bit of news. One thing that's interesting that came across my path recently is that my fellow podcasters, the good friends of Jackson Elias, are organizing an online games convention, which is a wonderful idea, and it's actually pretty soon already. It'll take place on the weekend of the 10th of July. So that's only 2 weeks from now, roughly. And there will be lots and lots of games being run by people who are fans of the show, including me. So if you would like to participate in a game of Cyberpunk 2020, well then go ahead and have a look. And of course there are many, many other games being run, most focused around the themes that the good friends of Jackson Elias podcast is famous for, which is horror. All right, and speaking of online conventions, I recently spoke to one of the organizers of Albacon, which is an online games convention where, again, you can play lots of games, but they will also host panels, and each player pays a little bit for playing the game, and all that money goes to a charity. It's really wonderful, so check out the link in the show notes, and of course, keep an eye out for that episode, which will be in about a month from now. Okay, so I can barely breathe, so let's move on to the actual contents of today's show. Alright, so adventure design. A lot of us have probably already designed several adventures if we ever ran a game. Maybe not, maybe you've just been using published adventures, or you haven't run a game at all yet, which is fine. When I started out creating my own adventures, I didn't really have a method as such. What I did was I looked at the adventures that I had been a part of as a player and thought about what did I think was cool about it, and try to riff on those kind of ideas. Nowadays, I tend to try out methods of people that are much smarter than me, such as Runehammer or the brain behind the Alexandrian website, Sly Flourish, to name but a few. And I'll go over a couple of their basic ideas, and of course there'll be lots of links in the show notes to their advice. And what I like about trying out other people's methods is that it gives you a fresh way to look at the activity of designing an adventure, because all creativity requires your brain to kind of get a kickstart to actually get this creative process going. And if you don't know where to start, that can be really, really difficult. And having some sort of method that you can apply to this activity can really, really help kind of boost your confidence and get you going. And before you know it, you're creating all kinds of really wild adventures. So one of the things I mentioned is this website called the Alexandrian. It is full of the most amazing articles, advice about DMing, etc., gaming. And one article that I came across when I was looking for a better way to write my adventures, because sometimes I can have a tendency to be a bit railroady in my adventure design. and I was looking for advice on how to improve that. And I came across this article called Node-Based Design, and I'll put a link to it. It really opened my eyes to a very different way of looking at adventure design in general. So rather than looking at it as a story, node-based design says no, there are several locations that the players can visit where things will happen, and where they might be able to find things or find out certain things. And if they don't go to them, well, then they're less equipped to deal with whatever's at the end. Or they might not even get there at all. And what really helped me with this node-based design is that it's such a simple idea, really. There are several nodes that are today's adventure, and players can go to them in a certain order or in a different order. It doesn't really matter. And each location or each node contains some hints to the other nodes that players may or may not find, and if they find them, they may or may not interpret them the right way. And it has helped me to create more free-flowing adventures with less prep time and less writing, and it allows me to give my players a lot more freedom, which I really, really liked. Another thing that I came across recently is a book called The Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. And this is by Sly Flourish, well known on the internet. And he's written this book to help you, again, with your game mastering process. And one of the things that I really appreciated about his approach is that he writes, when you go to sit down to write an adventure, the most important thing to look at, actually, is who are the characters? What are they about? What are they good at? What's their backstory? What's their tie-in to the whole campaign if you're running a longer campaign? And by thinking about those things, A, you're going to write an adventure that is suited to these characters, and B, you're going to be inspired by what the players came up with, which means that they will instinctively feel like, hey, this adventure is so cool. Like my character it feels like my character's in a real world. And of course, there's much more to it, and I would really advise you, if you haven't read it, to pick up a copy of the book and read it. It is very, very informative, and it's for a lazy DM, so it's not a very thick tome. It's pretty quick to read through, and I really enjoyed it. I do actually hope to get Sly Flourish on this show at some point to talk about it, but that's for a future episode. Another person who knows quite a lot about the design of adventures is Runehammer, who was, of course, our first guest ever on this show. And he has a whole playlist on his YouTube channel called Room Design. And in that playlist, he has videos where he goes through his process of creating an adventure. So he creates it pretty much on the fly during the video and explains the process behind it. And the more recent ones are they're really, really brilliant. So if you're looking for inspiration, or if you're looking for an insight into how Runehammer creates adventures or creates encounters, well, there's a wonderful library of stuff to watch there. So definitely learned a lot from his ideas as well. One of the things that I picked up from my adventure design from Runehammer was these dials that you can put up and down, and he calls them the 3 Ds. And those Ds stand for damage, disruption, and duration. He has a wonderful video about it, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But basically, he said, whenever you create a room in a dungeon or a part, let's say a node, of your adventure, it's good to think about how much damage is potentially going to be dealt to the players or to their characters, hopefully. Then disruption, so how much is the environment or our different effects going to make movement difficult or make spellcasting difficult, etc. So that's another dial that kind of, when you put it up and down, it changes the difficulty of an encounter. And then there's duration, so how much time do the players actually have to do a certain thing. Because if they have all the time in the world, it's not as tense as when you say, well, you have 10 seconds and then the bomb explodes or whatever it is. So those 3Ds, he says, if you put them up and down, that really, really helps to change the difficulty of any kind of encounter. And then, funny enough, he also has 3Ts, which helped me with my room design or with my adventure design, which were timers, threats, and treats. And treats is one that I tend to forget the most, which is really a wonderful addition to any kind of location in an adventure. Is think about what can the players find that can help them in this particular situation. And it can be stuff that can be used in different ways. So let's say we're in a cave and there's a huge rock that looks a little bit loose. Well, then, players that want to roll these perception type rolls are rewarded by knowing now, hey, there's this rock that you could potentially push over and maybe it'll fall on the goblins, or it will roll and block a certain entrance to stop more enemies from coming in, or whatever they want. So these treats out of the 3Ts really help me. And of course timers, well, that ties into the duration thing. So again, it helps to make things more tense. Whenever the timer runs out, something bad usually tends to happen. And then of course there's the threat. Without a threat, an encounter isn't all that scary. And then one last method that is out there that I would like to mention is the 5-room dungeon method, in which basically the premise is any dungeon or any, let's say, adventure or bit of an adventure can be comprised of 5 particular rooms or 5 locations, and they all have a specific function. And this is, again, it's a wonderful method. Check out the link in the show notes. And it's just another way of looking at your adventure design. You write down, you draw these 5 rooms out, and you start to think about, okay, what about this entrance? How can I make that interesting? And suddenly you're thinking about your adventure in a different way, and the creative juices start flowing. Speaking of creative juices, except for the one that's running out of my nose right now. Speaking of creative juices, inspiration is so important. And one thing that I read once that you can do when you're looking for inspiration is just read through the news. I know the news is terribly dark and grim these days for several reasons, but when you look at the news, though, you can get inspiration for things that can happen in your game. So, for instance, the start of my current D&D campaign, which is in Eberron, I was thinking about, okay, what can I do? And at that time, there was a lot of stuff in the news about terrorist attacks on trains or on the subway. I don't remember exactly. And that sparked the idea for the first adventure, in which the players were on not really a train, but a lightning rail. And there was a cultist attack happening. So I thought, okay, that's a good way to get them in the action very quickly. And that also sparked all the ideas that, that really made up a lot of the rest of the story, which is, why were these cultists doing that? What were they after? Immediately there's an enemy for the players to hate, to band together against. And it was just super interesting. And all that came from just, reading too much news about a terrorist attack, which of course in reality is horrible, don't get me wrong, but it can serve as inspiration for something that can happen in your game. Another, and I'll leave it, that one is the last one, I promise. Another inspiration phase method that I really like is word association. And you can create a mind map. And if you don't know what that is, just Google it. It's a pretty simple process of drawing a little circle. You write a word in it, and then there's lines coming out of that. So let's say I have, the word rock, because I want to have an adventure that's based around rocks for some reason. Then I can write rock, and then I can think, okay, what's interesting about rocks? And I can write a few words around it. Maybe something growing on rocks, or something that lives under rocks, etc. And from there out, I can once again start making all these subdivisions. So if it's something growing on rock, well, there's lichen. Okay, what interesting things do I know about lichen, and why would that be interesting? And maybe it's an ingredient for a potion that they're looking for. I don't know. So that's another way that you can kind of get going on adventure design. Because like most things, once you're going, it gets easier from there on. Now, I would like to leave it up to the professionals. So let's have a chat with Kelsey. Welcome to the show, Kelsey Dion. Kelsey has been a newspaper journalist, teacher at all grade levels, and a technology specialist for some of the world's largest companies. Most importantly, she's been a dungeon master since the age of 12. Wow. 19 years later, Kelsey now writes best-selling D&D content as the Arcane Library. She's become a regular at the Dungeon Masters Guild, and she can be found on YouTube, helping Dungeon Masters use her modules in the best possible way. Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
Yeah, wonderful. Great. And since you're a creator of adventures and modules, I think that's something that we can talk about at length. But I want to start with being a dungeon master at age 12. How did you manage that?
It's funny because I didn't plan to be a dungeon master at age 12. I had been playing D&D for about a year with my friends. And our regular dungeon master couldn't show up one weekend because he got snowed in. But we had all managed to make it to the local game store somehow. So we were looking around and saying, well, who's going to run a game then? And I just happened to be the person to put my hand up. And I ran a probably really bad first session for my friends. And it's been ever upwards from there.
Wow. Do you still remember what that first session was about?
Yes. It's funny. I actually I used my what was supposed to be my lunch money that day to buy like a $5 module called Jeremon's Orb, written by AEG. I actually managed to track down, I think on Drive-Thru RPG, a PDF version of that adventure. I know, and so I spent like 20 minutes just frantically reading through it and preparing it, and that was the first adventure I ever ran.
Oh wow. Okay. And so what would you say you learned from that module?
It's so funny. I learned, I think, from that module and from the entire experience that there's a actually pretty low threshold for the amount of prep you need to do before you're ready to run it. And there are diminishing returns from going past that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So and has that influenced how you write your own modules?
I think definitely, actually. It's funny because ever since then, I've always been more on the light side of prep. And because I was essentially running the adventure on the fly from what was written, I think that I've always embraced that method since then. I've always tried to write things that I know could be run as easily as possible, just looking at the details in the moment.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a very practical kind of approach, and I guess an approach that says be brave enough to trust your instincts when things start to go haywire. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. You have to be brave to DM, and you have to accept the unknown is going to happen for sure. So.
Yeah, because guiding players is like herding cats, right?
Exactly. So true.
Yeah. And so adventure design, it's something that a lot of us do, whether it's for our own homebrew games or to try and get out there as a published author. What's your method? How do you go about writing an adventure?
Yeah, so I have a mixture of sort of a set in stone process that I always do, combined with the more nebulous, like how do we even get ideas in the first place, and how do we know when they're ready to use? And I think that's sometimes tricky for people to decide that an idea is at the point where they're ready to use it. But there's also, it's funny too, there's the saying that ideas are abundant, but execution is rare. So I think that the first important part is finding something that you feel is cool enough to sit down and write something about, but then actually doing it. And the getting started part requires a little bit, I think you have to set yourself up to be able to do what you want to do. So like I have a template, an actual template document that I use when I start writing. And, it has places where I fill in like the adventure background and the synopsis, and it even has like pre-built sort of encounter structure that I can just take and turn into an encounter. And that's my trick for getting over the barrier of like, how am I going to actually turn this idea into writing? And I think any writer who wants to write adventures should work on building themselves some kind of template that they can use over and over again to ease that process.
Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds really great. So it's very structured. So if I were to open
Mhm.
up a few of your modules, I would see the same kind of structure again and again.
I think you would. Yeah, you would.
Mm.
And it's funny, they sometimes my adventures come out all at the exact same page length because I try to keep the structure I guess really precise. Yeah,
Hmm.
maybe even to a to a psychotic degree, but very like process driven in a way.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, and that helps you to be also maybe more productive, let's say, or that sounds a bit odd, but to get things done.
Well, it does. I think it does. It helps me stay productive. It helps me
Mm.
know what I'm writing and what I need to do to move the writing process forward.
Yeah.
And I really think it results in faster output, because a lot of
Mm.
that, how am I going to present this information, is not really something I have to worry about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And do you use the same approach for your home games where you don't publish anything, or?
Sometimes it's funny because my home games are sort of the less formal idea battery. My
Uh-huh.
players don't know this, but they're often play testing like encounters or things that I'm going to put in an adventure.
Ah, okay.
And so I don't usually make them so formal until I've run them through my players as sort of a litmus test.
Oh, yeah. Well, I
Mhm.
mean, I think that's clever, right? I mean, you don't know if something's going to work until you've unleashed it somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, it helps make you feel like your idea is valid if you've kind of put it through its paces a little bit and you're like, yes, this worked. I feel good about investing time in writing it, therefore.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's kind of like with teaching. So if you teach a particular class, like the third group that you're teaching is going to be so much better.
I'm
Because you've,
sure, because you've
yeah,
piloted the class 2 times prior. So,
exactly. Yeah. So
Mhm.
sometimes I tell my classes, like, "Oh, you guys are the first. You're unlucky this term." Yeah.
Oh
Uh,
man, I know, but it's
yeah.
good. Everybody benefits then. Everybody, you become a better teacher. Your students
Hmm.
get to benefit from the people who came before them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
mhm.
exactly. So back to the adventures. So you have a very particular process with a very structured approach. What would you say are some major pitfalls in adventure design, whether it's for publishing or not?
Yeah, I make mistakes constantly when I'm writing and designing, but I think that one of the biggest pitfalls, like on a large scale, is just too much information. I know
Mm.
it's a lot of people talk about this in adventure design and writing, but I think it's really critical, especially with the expectations around how RPGs are being presented in this era, the
Yeah.
modern era of everybody can publish and there's a ton of really cool stuff out there.
Hmm.
I think you have to really get to your point right away and not overwhelm the dungeon master with information that's really not going to come into play in the adventure.
Hmm.
Like an extremely lengthy adventure background that isn't even going to see the light of day in the adventure itself is probably not worth including.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and even so, too much information on that scale, and then too much information on a micro scale too. Like in an encounter or a room, I mean, do you need to tell people that it's a trophy room used by the manor of the house for the bears that he hunted in the forest to the north that's occupied by the barbarians who sometimes come through? Like, do you need to say that in
Yeah.
a room? Like, I've seen that. I've actually seen that. And so,
Yeah.
I would just scale it back.
Yeah. Yeah. And leave some room maybe for the person running the module to fill in the blanks.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they're not a robot. Like, they want to participate in the creativity as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. And also you can get kind of stuck if you the more detail you put in, you have to reread your own stuff so many times, I think, also as a
Yeah.
writer, because now we're
Mhm.
talking about bears and barbarians, and well, what do these
Yes.
bears do, what color are they, what's no that means we have to be in a certain location in the world where these bears exist.
Right. And then sometimes, exactly, that's a good point because
Hmm.
sometimes the more information you include, the more it destroys the reality. Because if you get a detail wrong,
Hmm.
you just undid like if I accidentally put a polar bear in a temperate climate, I just
Yeah.
ruined the believability of everything I'm writing.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. And it makes
yeah.
it harder, I think, also for people to fit your adventure into their existing campaign or their existing setting.
Yes, true.
The risk of details. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What about not enough information? Does that ever happen? Like that you don't have the information you need to run the actual game?
I think it can, absolutely. It's a difficult balance.
Mm.
And people write this differently depending on how they feel that their information is going to be used by the DM. So
Yeah.
um, there are some writers who assume that the DM is going to be spending a lot of time preparing before the game.
Hmm.
But I'm actually more of a writer where I assume that the DM is going to do some prep maybe, but they're mostly going to be running in the moment without having memorized or done a ton of ahead of time prep.
Yeah.
So how much information you choose to present at all is probably based on that prior assumption, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can definitely have too little if, I think that, for example, I think that sometimes people provide too little information on combat tactics for the monsters.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because one should not assume that all dungeon masters are skillful tacticians with the way that you intended the monster to be presented. It's a
Yeah.
difficult. I'm still learning about how to best leverage monsters, and so I always
Yeah.
try to provide some suggestions to the DM about how to run the monsters, like how
Mhm.
intelligent are they, what tactics are they going to use,
Yeah.
and that helps keep the combat interesting and intentional.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds really good. Yeah. Because I remember way back in my second edition days that I was reading Dragon magazine quite regularly, and they
Yes.
once had a whole article about 101 dirty orc tricks, and it was an eye opener. It was really,
That
really
is
good.
so. I love that. That is. I have to. Maybe that's archived somewhere. I would love to read that article.
Yeah, you can find Dragon and Dungeon magazine, I think, somewhere online because they're pretty old now.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah, and I'll see if I can find a link to it to put in the show notes. That article really opened my eyes to, yeah, of course they can do much more than just step up and swing a sword.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
How
definitely.
cool.
Yeah, because I find sometimes with published adventures, especially for crunchy games like D&D is kind of crunchy, I guess, or Starfinder in my case that I play that quite a lot.
Yeah.
That it says, for instance, the creature has poison. Okay, what does that do? Please give me
Right.
at least give me a page number or something. Because
Yeah.
the Starfinder manual, it's great. It's full of really cool detail, but sometimes you get referred from one section to another, and that can really grind the game to a halt.
Yeah. And do you find too that combat tactics are often given to you in pre-written adventures, or is it not so common?
It depends a bit, yeah. So I've played modules where you get all that stuff, and I really really appreciate that because it helps you to be a bit more surprising. Because I think as a game master, you easily fall into a certain rhythm when you're doing combat. Like,
Mhm.
oh yeah, I like when they do swooping attacks, or I like this. And then if you have a little note that says actually this one will throw a rock or will, I don't know, do something funky, then yeah, and it helps you to remember the special abilities because I've very often played really powerful creatures as a game master, and then afterward thought, "Oh no, I forgot about the lasers in the eyes. Why?" You know?
Lasers. I've done, you know what? I'm so guilty of that too. Especially like boss monsters that sometimes have
Yeah,
a lot of complexity. I just can't imagine somebody who's coming to your adventure for the first time just knowing how to leverage that all to the best ability. And then,
yeah,
and then it's, it's a shame because you don't want stuff to go to waste or to be unexciting or not as exciting as it could be. So,
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I tend to get kind of caught up in what the players are doing because they come up with the most crazy stuff, and then I'm
well, right. Yeah.
watching them like, "Oh yeah, 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 cool, good idea."
I know you invest
Yeah,
so much energy in just keeping the game moving, and like there's so much
exactly.
more on your mind than just the combat itself. Like there's pacing and NPCs, and oh, they went somewhere I didn't expect. Now I have to improvise a little bit, and
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
lot.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think quite a lot of my listeners at some point are writing adventures or scenarios for their games,
Cool.
and I'm sure they have a lot of them will have an ambition to maybe get one of their things published at some point.
Yeah.
What would you say is a good step to go from building an adventure for your home game to turning it into something you can sell?
Right. So a good step. I mean, you definitely want to focus on writing as clearly and presentably as you can. I think that's the most critical step. Um, And if you're going to invest effort in putting something together to publish, let that be your main focus, I think, from the start, is developing a presentation style that DMs will want to use.
Yeah.
And that's first and foremost. And I think anyone who runs games and plays in games kind of instinctively knows what information is the DM actually going to need. If I were running this, what would my eyes glaze over versus, lock onto and actually make use of? And so I think as you're writing your first adventure, let that be your guide. Would you use this the way it's written? Would you want to use this at your table and actually find value in what's here? Or would you just get flustered and skip over it or not make use of it in the way that was intended?
Yeah. And would you suggest like that people immediately start hiring like an editor and all that kind of stuff, or like how do you get through that kind of stage from, oh, I wrote this thing, it's a Word document, to it's now presentable, professional?
Right. So that's the next stage. It's I think that I would really encourage people to learn to write as cleanly as they can, and hopefully not necessarily need an editor. Spot checking is always great, especially if you can have a friend read through it and say, this doesn't read right. Yeah. But there's a mixture of learning some light editing skills and some light layout skills. But for example, I think this blows people's minds when I say this, which kind of cracks me up, but I don't actually use InDesign or any heavy like layout software. I don't even use Homebrewery, which is an online like HTML based one. I do every single thing of my layout in Apple Pages, which is a word processor.
Really?
I do, yes.
Wow.
And so I think there's this perception that you need to learn InDesign and you need to learn all this layout. And I guess I can say that from my personal experience, you don't have to. You can use the tools that you have, whether it's Word. You can do really very useful layout stuff just in Word. There's a lot of tricks that you can do. So don't feel that your lack of Adobe is going to prevent you from publishing.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's really cool. And so are there guides out there for using things like Pages or Word to make it look better than my average Word document?
Yes, there are. There's I think there are a lot of people who do things like YouTube videos for how to leverage word processors really well. Okay. Apple, because Apple Pages is an Apple program, if you happen to have a Mac, Apple has a ton of resources about all of the features Pages has and how to use them. And I even think on the DMs Guild, there are people who sell templates for like Word and word processors that are really professional and clean, and they're plug and play. So you can use those to make something that looks quite professional.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And you mentioned home brewery. That sounds tasty, but what is it exactly?
So it's an online, like a web-based layout tool that I think a lot of people use to lay out specifically like a Dungeons and Dragons looking document. It takes a lot of its visual cues from 5th edition's design language. I'm not, I've never really used it or tried to use it to its full potential, because I think you need to have some basic HTML and CSS knowledge and some patience with that. Okay. And I unfortunately do not, but but it is pretty approachable. A lot of people have said.
Oh, okay. Wow. I'll check it out and put a link in the show notes.
Yeah.
That sounds interesting. Okay. Because I was hoping that you would not need all this HTML knowledge, that it's like a plug and play, like, I just dump some text in it and it looks good, but it's not that easy.
I dump the text when I write. It's so funny. Yeah. I write right into the document that I'm going to also be putting, images and things into. And as unusual as people find that, it helps me write really quickly, and I can see how much space I have exactly in which to work. And then I can shape what I want to say around art that I need to include, things like that. So I find that to be, most people say first write your adventure, then do layout, and then edit it in its final stage. But I actually do that as I write all together.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that saves time.
It actually does. You'd think it would be overwhelming, but I don't. I find that it's actually extremely fast to write that way.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That sounds really good. Yeah. because I know that sometimes I create documents for my job as a teacher, and I try to make them look kind of nice, and then I write a whole bunch of text, and I dump a picture, and then Word does all this where the words dance around the picture, just not quite the way you want them to.
Yeah.
Now it doesn't fit on one page anymore, and then I get really finicky about it.
I know. Then you really that's always so brutal when you've written something and it's the best you want to make it,
Yeah.
and then the art kicks some of the words off the page. So
Yeah.
I try to write while doing art at the same time, so I know what I have to work with.
Yeah. And do you get your art commissioned somewhere specifically? Is there a good spot to get nice art for your books?
There's sometimes, I use a blend of commissioned work and stock art. Actually, there's a ton of high quality stock art, just tons of it that you can use through like Shutterstock, through Drive-Through RPG, all excellent. And then occasionally I'll get cartography or spot art done. Actually, sometimes through Fiverr, if you can believe it. I know that I think Fiverr might have a bad rap with some people.
I got my podcast artwork done there. I'm happy with it.
See, there you go. I'm not. See, I have to really delve into what people like and don't like about Fiverr. I wonder if there's a concern that their artists are not getting treated as well as they could be. But I've never found that to be the case with the people I've worked with. I've had extremely professional, wonderful interactions with artists on Fiverr who I assume by the volume of work they do that they're making a lot of money.
Yeah. What I liked about Fiverr specifically is that you get to see if somebody has already got 100 reviews and they're mostly positive, then you know what you're dealing with. Whereas if I approach an artist on I don't know, Facebook or Twitter, like, hey, you make cool stuff. Okay, but how do I know that they're going to be delivering on time, that they're easy to deal with, etc. If they're flexible.
Yeah. I really do like the platform because it's sort of takes some of the stress out of art directing. And it also is I think it's a really good thing for artists who don't want to have to haggle about pricing and don't want to they don't get paid on time. Like that's a lot of freelancers don't get paid on time or fairly, and that's just unbelievable to me. It's so
or people offer, you can do it for exposure.
Never. Yeah, just never. I would much more strongly suggest to writers to give their own work away for free rather than to ask for free work from others. You'll get a lot farther giving your own work away for free. But paying the people who helped you make it, that is the way to go in my opinion.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah. So you've written quite a lot of adventures already, most of them self-published through the Arcane Library, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah,
that's it.
And a few on the DM's Guild. What's a recent adventure that you created, and how would you describe it?
Yes, so the most recent adventure I published, which was actually about a month ago, I published on DM's Guild, and it is called The Corruption of Skyhorn Lighthouse.
Okay.
That's a long name. But it's a sort of nautical adventure for 5th edition D&D. And it's actually a follow-up adventure to one that I published previously on DM's Guild. Which is a free adventure. So if you want to scope that one out, it's called The Secrets of Skyhorn Lighthouse. And so that was a 5th level adventure, The Secrets of Skyhorn Lighthouse, the free one. And the one I just published continues the story of that one. But it could also work as a standalone if you have 8th level characters who just want to go on sort of a seafaring adventure and then dungeon crawl towards the end, an underwater dungeon crawl.
Oh dear. Okay. And do you include some of the logistics of underwater combat and stuff in the adventure, or do you say this is the page and good luck?
I do. I talk a little bit, especially in some of the tactics about monster tactics in underwater combat. I link to the rules about underwater movement and suffocating because they're a little bit lengthy, and so I didn't want to just reprint them in the adventure. But a lot of the design of the adventure went into how to make interesting combats that weren't frustrating because movement can be harder underwater. And then how to make being underwater dangerous when there's all kinds of magic that sort of nullifies it as an issue,
Yeah, exactly.
So, Mhm.
That's something that I found so difficult. Sorry to kind of take a sidestep here.
Oh yeah.
In Starfinder, in science fiction in general, you can create all these cool environments like underwater or some kind of gas planet or whatever it is, and then the players say, "Yeah, I have a spacesuit. Who cares?"
I know,
And
exactly.
it's similar in high level D&D. You go underwater. Okay, I'll get a ring of free movement, and there we go. Yeah,
There you go. I know. I know exactly. And so
yeah,
it's funny because it's also like you said, you want to letting the players use their equipment and feel
mm,
cool for having it is important, but
yeah,
then every so often you just got a little equipment malfunction or something, and
yeah, yeah,
that's actually mostly what it is I have areas in the adventure that have magic like nullifying properties
yeah,
if the characters aren't careful, and so
yeah.
that was kind of my way of causing equipment malfunctions.
Ah, yeah, yeah. Oh, that sounds really good. Yeah, because I think nothing will make a player sweat more than you saying, "Yeah, you have this bubble, right? This life bubble or whatever it's called. Yeah, it doesn't work anymore."
Right, exactly,
It's like running out
exactly.
of air when you're diving. That's terrifying.
It's terrifying. And you know what's funny is I'm sure that they will come up with a way to solve that problem somehow.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the fun part. Yeah,
Exactly.
to watch
Hmm.
that happen and go like, "Oh, clever. I like this." Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, and yeah, you got to be ready for weird surprises.
Hmm.
Um, and what would you say is the style of the adventure? So it's seafaring, it's nautical. Is it very epic, or is it kind of more low magic, or how would you describe it? Or maybe horror or comedy?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So it's funny because the precursor adventure I would have called a little bit more like horror, low magic.
Uh-huh.
But this one I actually want to take a slightly different bent on it. So this one's a little bit more epic magic, a little bit more um I don't want to call it gonzo because that's a little
Hmm.
too much.
Yeah.
It's definitely more vibrant and colorful as far as the magic goes, and the NPCs are much more um diff like I like for example in the first adventure most of the NPCs were humans, and then in this
Right.
one there are very few human NPCs. Like you have
Oh, okay.
goblins, you have ifrit or what are marids, underwater deities.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You have merfolk, so it's a lot
Mhm.
more of a exotic
Yeah.
cast,
More
you know.
outlandish. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay. That sounds good. And so when I look at some of your adventures, you have a bundle of different styles of horror games. That's so
Yes.
cool because I like in general I like horror role playing games like Call of Cthulhu, which
Hmm.
is a very niche thing for it's a specific type of horror.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, you seem if I look at what you have out there, you seem to like writing horror stories or horror adventures.
I do. It's so funny because I really never set out to write a lot of horror adventures. And I'm a big baby. Like I am so bad during scary movies. I'm like the one covering my eyes and like
Right?
climbing up the wall so I don't have to see what's going to happen. And it's, but for some reason, I think writing it is really fun because
Mm,
the core of most horror. I think regardless of the type of horror is suspense and
yeah.
discovery, you know?
Yeah.
So it's really fun to write that because it's kind of like all about laying out clues about what's happening, and simply the not knowing is what's scary to the
Yeah.
players.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy that kind of style, and so I ended up over time writing like 4 one-shot adventures that all were in the genre of horror, and I was like, well, I should just put these together and do a little compilation.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I noticed that when I was looking at your website. I thought, huh, okay, that's interesting. So maybe because horror affects you, like you said, when you're watching it, maybe it's also it feels more interesting, maybe to you
That might
to write.
be,
Yeah,
it's I find it to be a powerful genre, and that might be why I like writing it too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, cool. And so one other thing that you seem to be very interested in is minimalism. So we talked a little bit about the way that you work already shows some signs of minimalism and not using too many big expensive products, but keep it simple. You have a simple process, and that's enough. Um, and then I watched a video of yours on YouTube where you also explained that you carry out this minimalism further in your role playing game experience. So for our listeners who may not have seen that video, what makes you want to be minimalist in role-playing games?
Yeah, so it's, first of all, thank you for watching that video, because it's way too long. It is not minimalist. The video itself, it's like 25 minutes long or something. But I kind of go into my philosophy on writing and running games in it, and I think the core of what I want to do is impress people with quality, not quantity. You know, not the things I'm showing you, but how cool they might be instead. And I think that's at the core of everything that I strive to do with D&D. So, you know, I want my adventures to be as usable as possible. And that sometimes means they're not as flashy as some people's are. Or they're not full of, you know, carefully written prose meant to evoke this specific feeling. You know, I don't even write boxed text in any of my adventures that you're supposed to read to set the scene. And that's because I think that the DM can more effectively paint the scene on their own with just some cues.
Yeah, and knowing their players, etc. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I don't know if you found this to be true either, but if you're reading box text, I mean, sometimes, I mean, you go from being very organic with the way that you're speaking with your players to suddenly extremely robotic as you're reading this prescribed set of sentences. And it's very, like, their eyes almost glaze over when you do that in my experience. And so
I think it really depends on the person reading the box text. Like I was I think it's last year I was running a Call of Cthulhu game which had some interesting box text of stuff that I really couldn't come up with on my own, especially because I'm not a native speaker, so my vocabulary is it's all right, but it's not nearly as good as the writer of that scenario, who I spoke to on a previous episode.
Wow.
But he, you have to have a certain skill at reading it in a certain way that makes it interesting. So box text, I like it, and it helps me. And I'm sure I'm not the only non-native speaker that feels like, all these descriptions. Actually, it's kind of nice to have, but I totally understand why you wouldn't put them in. And
they're absolutely some well-written box text is just so good. You know, it really is so fantastic. And I can absolutely see too, like, where it can, if used right and if written right, it's actually extremely useful. But it's also, for me, it was also kind of a space consideration where I just write in very plain language, what's in a room. And, because I would hate to make a DM have to come up with an entire description on their own. I feel like that would be a little crazy. So it's a balance, but that's one area where I was like, what can I do with this extra space if I take this longer description out? And that was sort of at the end of the day, a minimalist decision, I guess.
And so is page count, is that still really a thing if you're publishing PDFs? Is that still, like, how does that affect the quality of your product?
So page count, it's funny because people used to really focus on word count as a marker for how developed an adventure was. Right, but I think now in the era of digital work, I think it's almost like word count and the length is just not a factor in determining quality anymore. So people shouldn't make it into a false idol, It just because something's longer doesn't mean it's better. No. And people used to have to hit like a certain page count so that it could print cleanly back to back on pages, for example. And that's not really a concern anymore. So I hope that people don't let that dictate their decision making too strongly anymore.
No. Okay. Now, because you mentioned running out of space, or so you have a particular page count that you like, but
you're right. I actually try to. So for me, in my case, I try to keep every encounter to one page.
Okay. For practical purposes, you don't have to flip through the book, kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. So you're right. So the overall length of the adventure is, it kind of, I suppose I don't know how much it would impact the overall length, but you're right. I only work within one page when I'm setting out a scene. So you're right, as far as how the space you have to work with is very particular when you're doing it that way.
Okay, but that sounds like a really good idea, because I've also played adventures where the monsters, for instance, are in the back of the book. So then you have to flip back and forth, or you have to make a copy and put it somewhere on your table behind your
or
screen.
you're explaining something that the players see, and then you realize there's more information on the next page that you were supposed to tell them.
Oh yeah, definitely. Okay. All right, so that also sounds like good advice then, to keep one scene or one encounter to one page.
Yeah, I like doing it. I highly endorse that. If you can do that, that would be awesome.
Yeah. And now, nowadays, I see a lot of people kind of around, for instance, Black Friday. There's all these shopping halls, etc. That doesn't interest me, but you see in the role-playing game scene, you see a lot of people showing, hey, look, I have 50,000 dice, or in some Facebook groups, I noticed recently that people are now taking shelfies, which is yeah. Pictures of
I've never heard that word. That's so
really?
Appropriate though. Yes.
It's like a picture of all the role-playing books and products that they have. What about you? Like, if you're a writer of such products, do you buy a lot of them to do your research, or do you have like a huge library, given the name of your company?
I know, you would think.
Yeah.
Well, as far as my physical book library, it's pretty small. It can all fit on, one shelf. And that's not to say I do buy a fair amount of digital work. I think because it's important to sort of keep up with what's going on in the publishing industry, and also just reading other people's writing is so inspiring. So I love doing that. But I try to stay away from like showing what I have to prove my authority in something.
Right.
People I think are trying to sort of like use that to prove that they're dedicated fans, and they are, for having that much stuff, they certainly are. But I just don't. I personally try to establish what I know how to do based on the work that I put out, rather than what I have.
Yeah. I think with the with the shelfies specifically, I think these people are collectors.
Exactly.
Aside from being avid gamers, etc. They like to collect. And I have to say, I like collecting RPG books that I really enjoy, but so far I'm looking to my right. Nobody can see that it's a podcast, but I'm still, I keep it to one shelf so far. So
and it's the thing.
Right.
If you love into, like, this is the thing, if you love collecting books and you love having them, and then do it, then have a huge library. If that is something that brings you joy and something that inspires you, then you should buy as many things as you can to further that positive experience you're having in the RPG community. So it's funny, because I always feel like people sometimes ask me if they should, like, well, should I Marie Kondo my book collection and get rid of all of the ones that don't bring me immense joy? And I'm like, no, like, don't do that. But I just like, as long as they're getting something out of it, that's the point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because I find myself, I tend to buy mostly the core book, or books that you need to run the game, the basic game, and maybe one or two source books, but that's it. Because some games, they have so many source books, it drives me nuts.
It's hard to keep up with sometimes.
Yeah, also financially even. But I also find that a lot of the content of those books, if needed, I could come up with, a new monster. It might not be as cool with cool art as in that book, but it'll work for my game.
It's kind of a mixture of like do it yourself and have the content that you're going to use consistently.
And I think that's the key with a lot of minimalism, right? Is that it's not about how many things you have, but it's about, do you actually use the things you have?
Exactly. Like, I know some people who I would call minimalists who have gigantic Dwarven Forge collections.
Right.
Like, and they use it. They use that stuff and they love using it. And so, funnily enough, maybe they have 3,000 times more stuff than the next person over, but they're genuinely leveraging all of it and enjoying it. So they're kind of being a minimalist in that way.
Yeah. I was very happy to see the section of your video where you show the printed minis on these paper standees, because I thought, oh yes, I do the same because I cycle to my games. I rarely play at home because we have a toddler who needs to
Oh,
sleep, and the gaming
yeah.
tends to be loud. So yeah, I got the idea from ICRPG, and I thought, oh, that's actually brilliant. And now, if I need
Yes.
something, I just look online for a cool piece of art, and I print it out at the appropriate size and fold it and put it in one of those little board game standees, and there you go.
Perfect. Yeah. And that achieves everything you need.
Yeah, yeah,
It's so cool. It's so much, and portability is, I think, such a joy, to be
yeah,
able to take your things to your game without hating every second of the way as you're cycling there. It's just
yeah,
so much better.
yeah. Because I don't want to take my car if I don't really have to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. With a crate full of books.
Brutal. It's
Yeah,
so painful.
yeah, yeah. Definitely. Yeah, one other thing that I was curious about is so you're a published author in the RPG world. How do you find your position in that scene to be affected by the fact that you're a woman?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's interesting because I think I I'm not sure. I really don't know how much of an impact it's had on what I've done. But I would like to think not much, really, because
Hmm,
um, I hope that if people scope out my work, it's on the merit of the work itself rather than who I am as a person.
yeah,
But I do think, I think that we're seeing this sort of golden age in D&D where there's so many women coming to the game, and that was not always true when I was a kid. When I was playing, I was the only girl playing in the store.
yeah.
Um, and and to be fair, everyone was awesome
Uh-huh.
about it. Nobody ever made me feel like I didn't belong.
No,
And I
that's
may
good.
be lucky because of that. I may be lucky because that might not be the same experience many other women have had.
Hmm.
Um, and I know that gaming zones are not always super friendly to women. Maybe not overtly,
Hmm.
but because it just seems like you're walking into a crowd of people that you don't know how much you have in common with them.
Right. Yeah.
So that's always kind of strange, but thankfully I personally don't think I've ever been put off or sent away from D&D. If anything, I've had people be so welcoming. When I was a kid, my dungeon master, who I mentioned, who had to stay home due to the snow once,
Mm.
I didn't know this at the time, but he's a well-known writer in the D&D community. He worked alongside people at TSR because I grew up geographically very close to where TSR was headquartered.
Oh.
And he set it up so that at my, I believe, 13th birthday, maybe 12th or 13th birthday, I went to this really big gaming convention called Gen Con.
Yeah.
And he pulled some strings and actually got a birthday little meetup with Gary Gygax to
Really?
come meet. Yeah, for me to go meet him one-on-one.
Wow.
Which was, I can't even believe, I just owe him so much thanks for that. And Gary Gygax, the co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons, was just the most kind and welcoming and excited person to know that I wanted to be a dungeon master. He was like, you have to become a dungeon master. And he was like, you'll do so well at it. And he told me to slap my players around like redheaded dwarves, like straight from his mouth. And I was like this 12-year-old kid, like, yes, I will, So he himself
That's
was just
brilliant.
so supportive and encouraging. And I'm just so lucky that, he took that approach with me and was a
Mm.
welcoming person into the game.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's really good. And do you
Yeah.
think, as a writer, do you think that in general that women and men might approach the game differently and write differently, or do you think that's nonsense?
Well, I think they might. I think because any writer is pulling from their own experiences,
Hmm.
and their own worldview.
Yeah.
I don't, I'm, I don't think that there's a more good
Mm.
uh, difference between the way that men and women write. I think they're just
Yeah.
differences.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's hard to quantify, but I think that having the different perspectives of different writers as a whole is always better for the
Yeah.
game. It's just making it a more broad form of art.
Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I totally agree, and I find when I play Dungeons and Dragons or similar games with a group, if it's different when it's only men or if there are women in the group, or maybe they're all women.
Hmm.
Um, there's a different, yeah, slightly different atmosphere in general, but also, you get a bigger mix of ideas and approaches to things. Yeah, personally, I prefer it. But I was just curious about that because when I looked at my list of RPG heroes so far, I'd mostly interviewed men, and I thought, hey, that's kind of weird. Um, you're not actually the first female RPG hero on this show. Amanda Hammond beat you to it.
Well deserved, though. Yeah.
But that's purely a planning kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I really felt like, yeah, like you say, it doesn't really matter what your gender is when you're a creator of anything. But I did think, oh, maybe it's interesting to talk about. Yeah,
Yeah, for
and
sure.
it's
And
it's
it's
yeah, and it's very good. I think it's very encouraging to hear that. Really, in your experience at least, doesn't matter.
right. It's been very positive and
Mm.
very, I have only good things to say about it. And
Yeah,
yeah,
excellent.
I would hate to think, I know that it's been tough for some women. Like there are some isolated or particular cases of women not being accepted, and boo to
Yeah,
that, whoever's doing that shouldn't be playing D&D.
yeah, yeah,
But as a whole, it's been awesome. And
yeah.
more of it. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. In my experience, whenever I look at the hobby of role playing games, I felt it's one of the most inclusive hobbies. No matter whether it's about gender or your orientation or your religion or where you're from, your background, etc. Um, and I've seen also in both tabletop RPGs and LARPing that people are welcomed no matter who they are, and that's one of the things actually I enjoy and that I admire about this hobby is, for a little while, you get to be with a group of people who are like-minded because they like the game,
Mhm.
and you get to play a character who is either really like you or completely different than you, and it doesn't matter. And if you want to escape from your daily reality, you can.
Mhm.
And if you want to explore a part of your daily reality, you also can. And I think that makes it like a, yeah, kind of automatically like a safe space for a lot of people.
I agree. Yeah, there's this
Mm.
just undercurrent of creativity and open-mindedness, I think, for anyone who's playing. I mean, you have to have that if you're playing a game that's centered on
Mm.
imagination. And so
Yeah,
it's just wonderful that, I think that that comes along with people just being very accepting.
yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
definitely. Yeah. Um, so one last thing, and then I'll let you go. Every single guest on the show gets this really tough question, and it is, who is your personal hero when it comes to role-playing games? And oh my God, you
Yes.
already met Gary Gygax, so let's see.
Oh gosh, I know. I didn't know what I had before me as a child. But um, in this current day and age, I think that the individual who's inspired me so much lately is Hank from Runehammer.
Mm,
He wrote the game Index Card RPG. He's just a first class guy. He's so creative. He's an amazing writer, amazing artist. He's even an amazing musician, which most people don't know about him.
mm.
Um,
The
and
dungeon DJ. Yeah.
yes, exactly. He's so good. And
Mm,
um, he he really welcomed me in particular into the RPG community when I was just getting a start. And
mhm.
I've had the amazing opportunity to write some things with him in his own game world since then. And oh my gosh, just not a more creative and welcoming and kind person can you find. He is
Mm.
just an excellent person in the hobby, and checking out his work would only do well for somebody. So
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more. He was actually the first person to also accept very happily to be on my show. So he kind of kickstarted this whole thing for me.
wow,
Because
oh
I
my
sent out a whole
gosh.
bunch of emails to people that I thought, okay, maybe they'll say yes. And he immediately emailed back, oh yeah, let's do that. That sounds fun. I was like, oh,
Oh my gosh. And it's so funny because he's so in communication with the people who appreciate his work.
mm.
And he would hate me for saying this, but I still get totally starstruck whenever he talks to me about anything.
Yeah.
Um, he's because he's just like such a iconic person at this point in the creativity and RPG community in general. So
yeah, absolutely.
so
Okay.
cool.
Well, that's a great answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And it's sad but true. The time to end this interview has arrived. So thank you so much for this wonderful interview, Kelsey.
Thank you. This was such a fun discussion. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, so another wonderful interview with a wonderful RPG hero over and done with. And yet again, I learned so much. So a couple of takeaways that I took from this particular interview. Well, make sure that when you're writing an adventure, err on the side of less information rather than more. If you're writing something, would you actually use it when you're running a game? If no, well, then don't put it in. Getting started is usually one of the toughest things, and Kelsey said, well, having a template to fill out can get you over this hurdle very quickly and speed up your writing in general. And then, of course, for me personally, another thing to help you get started, like I said at the start of the show, is to have a certain method that you want to try out. Also, don't sweat the super high production levels that you think you might need to publish something. Just make it look organized and nice and have good, tight content. That's much more important. And then last but not least, minimalism. Minimalism in gaming can mean a lot of things, but it mostly focuses on holding on to what you actually use and get joy from. And the rest, well, that's just ballast. And, well, I couldn't really leave out this particular one because I loved it. Apparently Gary Gygax once advised a 13-year-old Kelsey to slap her players around like a red-haired dwarf. And I find that very funny, being ginger myself. So whatever game you're playing or running, get out there and write a couple of cool adventures. And you know what? When you think they're cool enough, try them out on a couple of players. Maybe run a game for an online convention. Why not? And once you get an idea that the game is good enough, why not publish it? Just try, or at least share it online somewhere so other people can try it out. And an interesting thought to leave you with, well, look at all the stuff that you own for role-playing games and try to pick a few that you think, well, if I would have to leave everything behind, I want these to be in my bag at least. Well, that's it for episode 13, lucky number. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording. If you did, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps to get the podcast get heard. Want to keep up with the latest news about my podcast? Well, hop on over to Twitter at RPGHeroes1. Check out the full show notes with all the links at rpgheroes.buzzsprout.com. Want to support the show and join other supporters on my Discord channel? Then I would be honored if you check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/rpgheroes. You can also buy RPG products with my affiliate code. Check the show notes for more information. 2 weeks from now, I'll be talking to Professor Dungeon Master from the Dungeon Craft YouTube channel about improving your game. Until next time, stay heroic.